They called it a rapid response repair, but everyone in the industry knows that's just corporate shorthand for a suicide run. You don't get offered $85,000 for 30 days of work unless the job is dirty, dangerous, or desperate. In this case, I had a feeling it was all three. I'm a saturation diver. There are maybe a few hundred of us in the world who operate at this level. If you don't know what that means, here's the short version. When you work deep, really deep, you can't just swim back to the surface at the end of your shift. The pressure down there forces nitrogen and helium into your tissues. If you tried to surface, the gas would expand like a shaken soda bottle. Your blood would literally boil. You'd be dead before you hit the sunlight. So, we don't surface. We live in a pressurized hyperbaric chamber, a steel tube the size of a Winnebago, on the deck of a ship or dropped to the seafloor. We breathe a mixture of helium and oxygen because regular air becomes toxic at that depth. We stay pressurized to the same level as the water outside. For 30 days, I am not a human being living on Earth. I am a biological component of a high-pressure system. I am meat in a can. I was sitting in the sterile, fluorescent-lit office of Agiir Deep Sea Solutions in Aberdeen, staring at a stack of waivers thick enough to choke a horse. The air conditioner hummed with an irritating, rhythmic rattle, the only sound in the room besides the scratching of my own pen. "Initials here, here, and here," the hiring manager said. He was a soft man with soft hands, wearing a suit that cost more than my car. He didn't look me in the eye. That was my first red flag. And the death benefit beneficiary, just to be standard. "My sister," I grunted, scribbling the details. "What's the depth?" 1,200 feet, the North Atlantic Rift. I paused, the pen hovering over the paper. That's the twilight zone. No sunlight, just crushing blackness and water cold enough to stop your heart in seconds. That's deep for a pipeline fix. What exactly are we welding? Structural integrity brackets on Research Station Theta. It's an older habitat, decommissioned mostly, but we're bringing it back online for seismic monitoring. We've lost contact with the automated sensors. We need a team to go down, establish habitation, manually repair the external comms array, and weld some fatigue cracks on the support struts. Who's the team? You, Miller, and Davos. I knew Miller. He was an old salt, a guy who had spent more time breathing heliox than air. His joints popped when he walked, a parting gift from the nitrogen, but he was solid, unshakable. Davos, I didn't know. I met them an hour later in the medical bay. The physicals for sat diving are brutal. They check everything: bone density, lung capacity, dental cavities. Air pockets in a tooth can explode under pressure. I found Miller sitting on an exam table, looking like a piece of weathered driftwood. "Miller," I nodded, stripping off my shirt for the EKG. "Cole," he grunted, not looking up from the floor. "Heard the pay. Must be bad." 85 grand, I said. "Yeah, bad." The third guy, Davos, bounced in a moment later. He was young, maybe 26, too young for this depth in my opinion. He had that nervous energy, the kind that gets you killed when you're dealing with heavy machinery and zero visibility. He was scrolling frantically on his phone. "Did you guys see the charts? The bathymetry for the site? It's right on the edge of a subduction trench. The currents down there must be ripping." "We go where the money is, kid," Miller said, finally looking up. His eyes were hard, gray flint. "You check your seals, you trust the mix, you get paid. Don't overthink the geography." But Davos was right to be worried. After the medical cleared us, barely, in my case, thanks to a shimmering spot on my left lung from a bout of pneumonia last year, we went into the tactical briefing. The lead engineer projected a sonar map of the site on the wall. It looked like a jagged scar on the face of the planet. Station Theta was a small speck perched on a rocky shelf. Immediately to the west of the station, the shelf dropped away into nothingness, a vertical cliff plunging down into the abyss. The sonar couldn't even find the bottom of the trench next to us. It was just a black void on the map. "We have some anomalous acoustic data coming from the trench," the engineer said, adjusting his glasses. He played a sound file. I expected the usual underwater sounds, the groan of shifting tectonic plates, the click of whales, the hiss of vents. Instead, the speakers emitted a low, rhythmic thrumming. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like a massive, slow heartbeat, heavily distorted by miles of water. Hydraulics? I asked. Maybe a pump failure on the station. The station has been powered down for 8 months. There are no active pumps. We assume it's a geological resonance, wind moving over the water surface creating a reverb loop. Just ignore it. Ignore it. Right. We spent the next 6 hours prepping our gear. The sensory transition had already begun. The smell of the ocean, salt and rotting kelp, was replaced by the smell of machine oil, neoprene, and isopropanol. The sounds of the harbor were replaced by the clanking of chains and the high-pitched whine of the ship's crane. By the time we boarded the DSV Goliath, the sun was setting. The sky was a bruised purple, the clouds low and heavy. I walked to the railing of the support vessel and looked down at the water. It wasn't the inviting blue of a Caribbean postcard. It was a churning, slate-gray slab of hostility. It looked heavy. I lit a cigarette, savoring the smoke. It would be the last time I'd taste fire or fresh air for a month. Once we entered the saturation system, open flames were impossible. The high oxygen content in the chamber would turn a spark into an inferno. Miller walked up beside me, leaning on the rail. He wasn't smoking. He was just staring into the deep. "You ever get that feeling, Cole?" he asked quietly. "What feeling?" "That we ain't supposed to be down there? That the water, it pushes back." I flicked my cigarette butt over the side. I watched the tiny orange ember fall until it hit the gray waves and was extinguished instantly. "It's just physics, Miller," I lied. "Pressure and paychecks." "Yeah, physics." A loudspeaker crackled to life, the voice distorted and metallic. "Dive team to hyperbaric transfer lock. Pressurization begins in 15 minutes. My stomach tightened, a cold, hard knot that had nothing to do with the stale coffee I'd had earlier. I took one last deep breath of the cold sea air, tasting the sea spray, trying to memorize the feeling of the wind on my face. "Let's go get rich," I said, turning my back on the horizon. We walked into the steel belly of the ship, and the heavy iron door slammed shut behind us with the sound of a tomb being sealed. The wheel spun, the locks engaged, and the hiss of incoming gas began to drown out the world we were leaving behind. We were committed. There was no way out but through the bottom. The first thing that hits you when the pressurization starts isn't the claustrophobia, it's the heat. People assume it gets cold instantly, but physics is a cruel mistress. As the gas pumps screamed to life, slamming compressed helium and oxygen into the transfer chamber, the temperature spiked. It was like being locked inside a car parked in the Sahara with the windows rolled up. Within seconds, sweat was pouring off us, soaking our fire-retardant flight suits. The air grew thick and heavy, almost syrupy in the lungs. Then came the squeak. "Check your seals," Miller said, but it didn't sound like Miller. It sounded like a cartoon duck who had inhaled a balloon. That's the heliox. Helium is lighter than air, so sound waves travel through it faster, shifting the resonant frequency of your vocal cords. In any other context, 3 grown men sounding like chipmunks would be hilarious. At 30 fathoms and dropping, it's horrifying. It strips away your humanity. You can't scream for help down here without sounding like a joke. "Seal's good," Davos squeaked back, his eyes wide and darting around the riveted steel walls. He was vibrating, his hands gripping his knees so hard his knuckles were white. We sat there for 4 hours while the chamber slowly pressurized to the equivalent of 400 meters of seawater. We blew down to depth while sitting on the deck of the ship. My jaw ached from constantly clearing my ears, a rhythmic pop, pop, pop that echoed inside my skull. When the gauge finally hit the red marker, the heat dissipated, replaced instantly by a bone-deep dampness. We were now saturated. If the door opened now, we would explode. We were ready for the drop. "Transfer," I said, my voice high and reedy. We crawled through the circular mating trunk into the diving bell, our elevator to hell. If the deck chamber was a Winnebago, the bell was a broom closet. It was a sphere of reinforced steel, barely 6 feet across, packed with valves, gauges, and 3 umbilicals coiled like sleeping snakes. It smelled of ozone, grease, and the distinct copper tang of fear. Miller dogged the hatch shut. I heard the heavy thud clank of the locking mechanism sealing us in. Then, the lurch. The bell swung free of the ship's hard mount. For a second, we dangled in the air, suspended by a single braided steel cable. Then, with a splash that vibrated through the hull, we hit the water. We sank through the moon pool, the open well in the center of the ship's hull. Through the thick quartz glass porthole, I watched the artificial lights of the DSV Goliath fade. We passed the ship's thrusters, massive propulsors churning the water into a milky froth. And then we were gone. The descent is the longest commute of your life. The crane operator topside lowers you slowly to avoid swinging the bell into the ship's keel or snapping the umbilical. I watched the porthole. The water shifted from a turbulent, bubbly gray to a deep, bruising blue. At 200 feet, the sun began to fail. It didn't fade evenly. It was devoured. The blue deepened to indigo, then to a heavy, suffocating violet. By 600 feet, the sun was a memory. We were in the midnight zone. "Passing 600, Davos whispered. He was staring at the depth gauge, mesmerizing himself with the numbers. Halfway. Outside, it was pitch black. Not the darkness of a room with the lights off, but a primordial, heavy blackness that felt solid. The only light came from the faint glow of our instrument panel and the external spotlight beaming down into the nothingness. The beam caught particles of marine snow, dead organic matter drifting down from above, swirling like dust motes in a sunbeam. Creak. Groan. The steel hull protested. The pressure was building. Tons of water were squeezing the sphere from every direction. You could feel it in your teeth. The air inside the bell grew denser, changing the acoustics. The hum of the scrubber fans became a dull roar. "I see structure," Miller said, peering out the bottom viewport. I crowded in to look. Far below, at the very limit of our spotlight's reach, a shape emerged from the gloom. Station Theta. It looked like a tick burrowed into the skin of the Earth, a series of 4 cylindrical modules connected by tunnels, resting on a flat shelf of rock. To the left of the station, the spotlight beam just ended. That was the cliff, the drop-off into the trench. Even from here, looking at that edge gave me a sense of vertigo that made my stomach roll. The station was dark, dead. It was covered in a layer of gray silt, making it look like it had been carved from the rock itself. "Deploying guide wires," the topside supervisor's voice crackled in our headsets. It was the only normal-sounding voice left, distorted with static, but deep and human. We felt the bell shudder as the guide weights latched onto the station's receiving platform. We slid down the wires, drifting closer to the airlock on top of the main habitat module. Contact in 3, 2, 1. Clang. The sound was violent, a hammer blow that rang through the hull. We had landed. "Mating seal engaged," Miller reported, his hands flying over the valve controls. "Draining the trunk." We listened to the hiss of water being pumped out of the space between our hatch and the station's hatch. It took an agonizing 10 minutes. If that seal failed when we opened the door, the pressure differential would liquefy us. Finally, the green light flickered. "Pressure equalized," I said. Miller spun the wheel on the floor hatch. It groaned, rusted and stiff, but it turned. With a heave, he pulled it open. Below us lay the dark, gaping throat of Station Theta. A smell wafted up, stale, metallic, and cold. It smelled like the inside of an old freezer that had been unplugged for years. "Home sweet home," Davos muttered, his voice trembling. I dropped down the ladder first, my boots clanging on the grate of the habitat ground. I unclipped my flashlight and swept the beam around. We were in the transfer lock. Pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping with condensation. The walls were painted a sterile institutional green, now peeling and blistered. I moved to the main bulkhead door and wiped a layer of grime off the viewport. I shone my light into the living quarters beyond. Dust motes danced in the beam. A coffee cup sat on a metal table, undisturbed. A jacket was draped over a chair. It looked like the crew had just stepped out for a smoke break and never came back. But there was something else. On the far wall of the habitat, barely visible in the gloom, there was a dark stain. It looked like grease or maybe black mold. It was smeared in a frantic circular pattern around the emergency comms panel. "All clear," I lied, my heart hammering a new rhythm against my ribs. "Get the gear, we're in." The umbilical from the surface was still connected to the bell above us, our only lifeline to the world of light and air. But standing there in the cold, dead silence of Station Theta, feeling the weight of the ocean pressing on the rivets, I didn't feel like a diver. I felt like bait. The transition from the diving bell to the habitat wasn't just a change of location, it was a reduction in dignity. We crawled on our hands and knees through the connection trunk, dragging our heavy gear bags behind us, scraping against the cold steel like rats in a sewer pipe. When I finally stood up in the main living module of Station Theta, the first thing I noticed was the smell. It wasn't the sterile machine shop scent of the bell anymore. It was organic, a thick, cloying mixture of unwashed bodies, mildew, chemical toilets, and the sharp electric tang of ozone. It smelled like a locker room that had been sealed inside a tomb for a decade. "Powering up the ECS," Miller squeaked. Even his gruff demeanor couldn't defeat the helium. He moved to the life support panel, his movements efficient and practiced. I swept my flashlight around the room. The habitat was a generous term. It was a horizontal cylinder, maybe 8 feet in diameter and 20 feet long. This was our entire world: kitchen, command center, dining room, and sanity buffer. The walls were lined with conduit pipes, valves, and labeled storage lockers. Every square inch of space was utilized. The ceiling was so low that even at 5'10", I instinctively hunched my shoulders. "Lights," Miller announced. With a heavy thunk of a relay, the overhead LEDs flickered to life. They were harsh, clinical white strips that buzzed with a low-frequency aggression. The sudden illumination revealed the true state of the station. The walls were sweating. Condensation slicked the painted steel, gathering in droplets that ran down into the floor grating. It looked like the station itself was running a fever. "Jesus," Davos whispered. He was standing near the bulkhead, hugging his duffel bag to his chest. It's smaller than the Sims." "Wide-angle lenses, kid," I said, putting my bag on a fold-down table. "Real estate is expensive at 50 atmospheres." I walked over to the stain I had seen from the airlock. Under the harsh lights, it looked less like grease and more like dried resin. I ran a gloved finger over it. It was tacky, dark brown, and smeared across the plastic casing of the comms array. It looked like someone had slapped the panel with a dirty hand and dragged it down. "What is that?" Dobbins asked, stepping closer, his eyes wide. "Hydraulic fluid," I lied. "Probably a leaky seal in the overhead lines. Don't touch it." I wiped my glove on my thigh. It didn't look like hydraulic fluid. It looked like kelp paste. "Scrubbers are online. CO2 levels are high but dropping. Temperature is 50 degrees and rising. We'll be habitable in an hour." "Habitable," I scoffed. "Let's get the sleeping quarters sorted." We moved to the rear of the cylinder, past the tiny galley, which consisted of a microwave and a hot water dispenser, to the bunking area. It was just a recessed alcove with 3 racks stacked vertically. They weren't beds, they were shelves with thin foam mattresses. "I'll take the top," Davos said quickly. He obviously didn't want the weight of 2 men above him. "Top is yours. Miller gets bottom, I'm in the middle." I threw my sleeping bag onto the middle rack. It was barely wide enough to turn over. When I laid down, the bottom of Davos's bunk would be 4 inches from my nose. "All right, listen up," I said, turning to face them. The helium voice was annoying, but I pitched it as commanding as I could. "We're on the clock. Aegir wants the external comms array fixed ASAP so they can get their telemetry. That means an excursion tomorrow at 0600. Miller, you're dive supervisor. Davos, you're on the umbilical. I'm doing the weld." "Why am I on the umbilical?" Davos asked, defensive. "I'm certified for the torch." "Because it's your first sat dive and I don't want you welding in the dark until you get your sea legs. I manage your line. You watch my back. You keep me breathing. That's the most important job out there." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Okay, yeah, okay." We spent the next few hours unpacking and running system diagnostics. It was busy work, designed to keep our minds off the reality of our situation. But you can't ignore the physics for long. Living in saturation is physically exhausting. The air is dense, literally dense. You have to work harder to drag it into your lungs and push it back out. Simple conversations leave you winded. The thermal conductivity of helium sucks the heat right out of your body, so despite the heaters cranking the room to 80 degrees, we were all wearing wool beanies and thermal lighters. And then there was the noise. The ocean isn't silent. The station creaked constantly. Metal contracts in the cold and shifts under pressure. Every few minutes, a loud pop or bang would ring out from the hull, sounding like a gunshot. "Settling," Miller muttered, unprompted, every time it happened. "Just settling." Around 2200 hours, I decided to take a look out the main viewport. It was a thick, circular window near the command desk, made of layered acrylic glass 6 inches thick. I pressed my face close to the cold plastic. I cupped my eyes around my hands to block out the reflection of the habitat lights. Outside, it was an absolute suffocating void. The darkness was so complete, it felt like it had weight, pressing against the glass, trying to break in. I stared into it, waiting for my eyes to adjust, hoping to see what? Fish? Bioluminescence? Nothing, just black. But then I felt it, a vibration. It wasn't a sound I could hear with my ears. It was a thrumming in the floor plates, traveling up through the soles of my boots. Thump, thump, thump. It was the same rhythm we'd heard on the tape in the briefing room. Slow, massive, rhythmic. "You feel that?" I asked, not turning around. "Feel what?" Miller asked. He was heating up a pouch of dehydrated beef stew. "The vibration." Miller stopped moving. The habitat went quiet, save for the hum of the scrubbers. We waited. Thump, thump. "Pumps," Miller said, though he sounded less sure this time. "Maybe a subsea current hitting the support struts." "Yeah," I said, pulling back from the window. "Currents." I looked back at the glass one last time. For a split second, a fraction of a heartbeat, I thought I saw something block the darkness. A shadow moving within the shadow, a shape that was darker than the water, sliding past the viewport like a curtain being drawn. I blinked, and it was gone. "Dinner's ready," Miller squeaked. I turned away from the window, my heart doing a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I told myself it was eye fatigue, pareidolia, the mind trying to make sense of the sensory deprivation. But as I sat down to eat my lukewarm paste of beef and chemicals, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness outside wasn't empty. We were in a tin can at the bottom of the world, and we had just rung the dinner bell.
Sleep in saturation is a myth. You don't sleep, you drift in a haze of micro-naps, interrupted by the groan of the hull and the hiss of the scrubbers. When Miller shook my shoulder at 0500, I felt like I hadn't closed my eyes. "Coffee's dead," Miller squeaked. "Heaters are primed. Time to earn the paycheck." The ritual of suiting up is a two-man job. We don't wear standard wetsuits down here. At 1,200 feet, the water is 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Neoprene compresses to the thickness of paper, offering zero insulation. If you went out like that, the cold would suck the heat from your core in minutes, and you'd be dead of hypothermia before you finished your first weld. Instead, we wear hot water suits. They look like baggy, rubberized pajamas threaded with a network of internal tubing. A pump on the habitat sends a constant stream of 110-degree water down the umbilical, flooding the suit and keeping us in a warm, fluid cocoon. It's comforting, but it's also a terrifying dependency. If that hot water line kinks or snaps, you have about 5 minutes of consciousness to get back inside. Davos helped me into the heavy rubber bib. His hands were shaking slightly as he checked the connections. "You good, kid?" I asked. My voice was still high, but the fatigue added a gravelly undertone. "Yeah," Davos said, not meeting my eyes. "Just dreamed about the drop, the wire snapping." "Don't dream," I said, clapping a heavy hand on his shoulder. "Focus on the loop. You manage my slack. You feel the line. You are my lifeline. Don't let me drape it over a sharp edge." I sat on the bench in the wet pot, the small antechamber where the floor opens directly into the ocean. Miller lowered the heavy Kirby Morgan helmet onto my head. The world narrowed down to the rectangular viewport. The smell of the habitat was replaced by the smell of the oral nasal mask, rubber and stale humidity. Click! Quunk! Miller locked the neck dam. I was sealed. "Comms check," Miller's voice crackled in my earpiece. "Loud and clear," I said. The regulator demanded effort to breathe. In hiss, out gurgle. "Flood it," I ordered. Miller turned the valve. Water rushed up through the floor grating. The cold hit my boots first, then the hot water from my suit kicked in, wrapping me in a bizarre, scalding embrace. As the water level rose over my faceplate, the view distorted. I was weightless. "Diver leaving the bell," I reported. I pulled myself down through the trunk and out into the abyss. The first thing that hits you is the absolute shrinking of your world. The external floodlights of Station Theta carved out a sphere of visibility maybe 30 feet across. Beyond that, nothing, just a wall of particulate matter, marine snow, falling endlessly like gray ash in a nuclear winter. It reflected the light back, creating a mesmerizing, claustrophobic curtain. I drifted along the handrails of the habitat, my umbilical trailing behind me like a thick orange tail. Davos was inside the wet pot, feeding me line. "I have you," Davos said over the comms. 40 feet of slack." "Copy. Approaching the comms array." The array was a twisted mess of steel latticework jutted out from the side of the habitat. The storm, or whatever damage had hit it, had sheared a support strut clean off. "I pulled my welding torch from my tool belt. Grounding the clamp," I said. "Striking an arc." I triggered the torch. A blinding violet-white light erupted, instantly boiling the seawater around the tip. Bubbles of steam exploded and collapsed violently, creating a deafening crackle-pop hiss that vibrated through my helmet. For 20 minutes, I was just a worker. I focused on the puddle of molten metal, the weave of the weld, the technical perfection of joining steel in a hostile environment. The world was just the arc and the shadow. But welding underwater plays tricks on you. The intense light casts profound, shifting shadows that dance in your peripheral vision. Every time the bubbles cleared, the shadows seemed to lunge. "Hold up," I said, releasing the trigger. The darkness rushed back in, heavier than before. "Issue?" Miller asked from the control desk inside. "Just checking the bead," I lied. I turned my head to the left. The comms ray hung right over the edge of the shelf. My boots were magnetized to the station hull, but just 3 feet away, the rock ended. The trench. I shone my helmet light down. The beam cut through the water for 50 feet and then just died. It didn't fade. It was swallowed. It was like looking into the pupil of a god. And then I felt it. Not a sound, a sensation. The hair on my arms stood up inside the hot water suit, the primitive lizard brain instinct that screams, predator. I wasn't alone. "Davos, take up slack," I said, my voice tight. "I feel drifting." "I got you tight, Cole," Davos replied. "Line is taut." I looked at the edge of the light, right where the gray water met the black void. Movement, subtle, fluid, and massive. It looked like a ribbon of oil, slightly darker than the water, undulating just beyond the range of my visibility. It was huge, maybe 20 feet long. It moved with a grace that defied the crushing pressure. "Miller," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my squeaky voice. "You seeing anything on the external cameras?" "Negative, just snow and your ugly mug. Why?" "I thought I saw something. A seal, maybe? Or a squid?" "At this depth?" Miller scoffed. "Maybe a 6-gill shark if you're lucky, or unlucky. Don't pet it." I turned back to the weld, but the rhythm was gone. I felt exposed. I felt like a worm on a hook. Every time the welding arc flashed, illuminating the abyss for a split second, I expected to see a face pressed against the dark, watching me. Then, a sharp tug on my umbilical. It jerked my head back. "Davos, watch the tension," I snapped. I didn't pull," Davos stammered. "The line, something hit the line outside." I froze. The umbilical ran from my waist, looped through the water, and went back into the habitat trunk. "What do you mean, hit it?" "It jumped in my hands," Davos said, his breath coming fast over the loop. "Like something plucked it, like a guitar string." I grabbed my umbilical and looked back toward the trunk. The thick yellow hose was vibrating. Not from the current, it was twitching. "Get me in," I said. "Job's done. Get me the hell in." "Retrieving," Davos said, pulling hard. I scrambled back along the handrails, my movements jerky and uncoordinated. I didn't look back at the trench. I refused to look back. But as I pulled myself up into the trunk, leaving the cold, crushing dark behind, I could have sworn I heard a sound over the comms loop. Not static, not the hiss of the regulator. A low, wet clicking, like stones being clicked together underwater. I scrambled up into the wet pod, water cascading off my suit. When I breached the surface of the moon pool, I ripped the regulator out of my mouth, gasping the thick helium-rich air. Davos was staring at the coil of umbilical in his hands. He looked pale. "What is it?" I asked, unclipping my helmet. He held up a section of the thick yellow hose. About 10 feet from where it had been attached to me, the tough rubber outer casing was scored. 3 parallel scratches, deep enough to expose the braided reinforcement underneath. "We snagged on something," Miller said, coming into the room. "Sharp metal on the array." "Yeah," I said, staring at the marks. They were perfectly spaced. They didn't look like jagged tears from a rusty bolt. They looked like claw marks. "Just sharp metal," I repeated, closing my eyes. "Let's get some food." But my hands were shaking so bad I couldn't unlatch the hatches on my helmet. I knew what metal felt like. I knew what rocks felt like. Whatever touched my line wanted to see if I was attached to it. It was testing the string.
Adrenaline has a nasty hangover. After the dive, the chemical dump in my brain left me feeling hollowed out, vibrating with a fatigue that settled deep in my marrow. We had debriefed, logged the dive time, and eaten another round of rehydrated sludge that the packaging claimed was chicken teriyaki. Now the lights were dimmed to the night setting, a deep submarine red intended to preserve our circadian rhythms, though time had already lost all meaning. I lay in the middle bunk, staring at the bottom of Davos's mattress. It was sagging in the middle, just inches from my nose. I could hear his breathing, shallow, rapid flutters. He wasn't sleeping. He was lying there terrified, probably replaying the sight of those scratch marks on the umbilical over and over again. Below me, Miller was snoring. It was a rhythmic, wheezing sound, distorted by the dense atmosphere into a high-pitched whistle. It was annoying, but also strangely comforting. Miller could sleep through a hurricane. His indifference was the only anchor we had left. I closed my eyes, trying to force my body to shut down. The habitat was never silent. It was a living thing. The scrubbers hummed with a ceaseless, monotonous drone. The condensation pumps chugged intermittently, sucking moisture from the air. And the hull was a symphony of stress. Ping. A thermal pop from a cooling pipe. Groan. The steel ribs shifting under the weight of the Atlantic. I told myself these were the sounds of safety. These were the sounds of the machine doing its job, holding back the crushing fist of the ocean.
I tried to focus on the warmth of my sleeping bag, trying to ignore the pervasive dampness that made everything stick to my skin. I must have drifted off, a shallow, uneasy gray-out. Clang! My eyes snapped open. It wasn't a pop, it wasn't a groan, it was a hard, percussive impact, violent. For a second, silence hung in the habitat, thick and heavy. "What?" Davos whispered from above, his voice trembling. "What was that?" I lay still, every muscle tensed, holding my breath. Clang thud! The second one was louder. It vibrated through the aluminum frame of the bunk. It came from the starboard wall, the side facing the trench. "Miller?" I shouted, swinging my legs out and dropping to the floor grate. Miller was already awake. He was sitting up, rubbing his face with a calloused hand. In the red emergency light, his face looked deeply lined, carved from granite. "I heard it," Miller grunted. "Calm down." "Calm down?" Davos scrambled down from the top bunk, nearly landing on my head. He was wearing just his thermal underwear, shivering violently. "That wasn't the station. Something hit us." "It's the current," Miller said, his voice level, though his eyes were darting toward the instrument panel. "We're on a shelf. Currents change. Probably a rock tumbling down the slope and hitting the legs." I walked to the starboard bulkhead. I placed my palm flat against the cold, sweating steel. I closed my eyes, feeling for vibrations. "Miller," I said, my voice low, "currents don't sound like metal on metal. That sounded like a hammer." "Debris, then," Miller insisted, standing up and moving to the command desk. He tapped a few keys, bringing up the external sensor diagnostics. "Hull integrity is 100%. No pressure drops, no leaks. Go back to sleep." "I'm not going back to sleep," Davos squeaked, his voice cracking into hysteria. "There's something out there. Cole saw it. The scratch marks." "Stow it, kid," Miller snapped. The sudden volume in the small steel tube was deafening. "You start panicking, you start breathing too much O2. You burn through our reserves. We are professionals. We deal with facts. Fact, the hull is intact. Fact, we are secure." I stayed at the wall. The metal was freezing against my hand. Then, I felt it. It was faint, so faint that if I hadn't been touching the wall, I would have missed it. Scrape. It was a slow, deliberate dragging sound, like a heavy ceramic plate being pulled across a granite countertop. It started high on the wall, above my head, and slid downwards, tracing a vertical line. It stopped right where my hand was resting. I snatched my hand back as if the metal had burned me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Miller froze at the console. He didn't turn around. I saw his shoulders stiffen. He'd heard it. "Settling," Miller said, but the conviction was gone. It was just a word now, a shield he was holding up against the dark. "Thermal contraction. The metal shrinks in the cold. It rubs against the insulation." "That wasn't shrinking, Miller," I said, stepping back into the center of the room. "That was tactile. It was exploring." Davos was backed into the corner near the galley, his eyes wide and wet. "It wants in! It knows we're here!" "Stop," I said to Davos, trying to regain control of the room. "Whatever it is, debris, fish, or thermal, it can't get in. This steel is 3 inches thick. It's rated for 50 atmospheres. Nothing short of a torpedo gets through this." I was trying to convince myself as much as him. We stood there in the crimson gloom for a long time. 5 minutes, 10. The only sound was the scrubbers and the frantic pounding of my own heart in my ears. "Look," Miller said, turning around. "If it was something big, a whale or something, it probably bumped us and swam off. Curiosity, it happens." "Whales don't go this deep. Not sperm whales, not this deep." "Squid, then. Giant squid. They have beaks. They bump things." "Sure, a squid." I didn't believe it. The impact had been hard, heavy, solid. A squid is soft tissue. This had the ring of bone or stone. "Go back to racks. We have a shift in 4 hours. I'll stay on watch for an hour, monitor the sensors." I looked at Miller. He looked tired, old. He knew something was wrong, but his job was to keep the panic containment field intact. "All right," I said. "Come on, Davos, up you go." I practically had to lift the kid back into his bunk. He lay there curled in a fetal ball, facing the wall. I climbed into my rack, but I didn't lie down. I sat cross-legged, watching Miller at the desk. He wasn't looking at the sensors. He was staring at the blank monitor of the external camera feed, which showed nothing but black static. I lay back, staring at the curved ceiling. I imagined the ocean outside, millions of tons of water, and in that water, something had just knocked on our door. The terrifying part wasn't the noise, it was the intent. Debris falls, currents push, but a knock? A knock is a question. Is anyone home? And then, just as I felt my eyelids growing heavy again, I heard one last sound. It didn't come from the wall this time. It came from the floor grate right below the moon pool access hatch. Tap, tap, tap. Deliberate, gentle. Miller didn't react. Maybe the scrubbers drowned it out for him, but I heard it. It sounded like a finger tapping on glass. I pulled the sleeping bag up over my head, squeezing my eyes shut. I felt a cold sweat breaking out all over my body, unrelated to the humidity. We were in a tin can, and something was testing the lid.
The morning shift briefing, if you could call it morning in a place where the sun is a theoretical concept, was tense. The air in the habitat felt thicker, heavier. The scrubbers were working overtime to pull the CO2 out of the atmosphere, but they couldn't scrub the fear. Davos looked like a ghost. His skin was pasty, waxy under the harsh LEDs, and his eyes were rimmed with red. He hadn't slept. Every time the hull groaned, he flinched, his eyes darting to the ceiling. "We need to visually inspect the impact site," Miller said. He was leaning over the schematics table, tracing the hull line of the habitat. His hand was steady, but his jaw was set so tight I thought his teeth might crack. "If that settling caused structural deformation, we need to know before the pressure finds a weakness and turns us into soup." "I'm not going out," Davos whispered. It wasn't defiant, it was a simple statement of fact. "I can't go out there." "I'll do it," I said, cutting off Miller before he could explode. "Davos is a liability in the water right now. Put him on the loop. Miller, you watch the sensors. I'll go check the dent." Miller looked at me, then at Davos and nodded. "Suit up." The routine was the same, but the feeling was different. Pulling on the hot water suit felt less like putting on protection and more like wrapping myself in a shroud. When I dropped through the moon pool, the water felt hostile. It wasn't just cold, it felt aggressive. It pressed against my suit with a weight that felt personal. "Diver clear," I reported. My voice in the helmet was a rhythmic whoosh hiss of the demand regulator. "Approaching the starboard flank." I pulled myself along the external handrails, floating through the eternal twilight of the artificial lights. I made my way to the spot where we had heard the knock the night before. It wasn't a rock. There was a dent in the steel plating. It was about the size of a dinner plate, depressed maybe half an inch, but it wasn't scratched or jagged like an impact from debris would be. It was smooth, concave, like someone had pressed a thumb into a ball of clay. "Miller?" I said, staring at the depression. "I'm at the site. It's localized deformation, no hull breach, but the metal is bent inward." "Debris impact?" Miller asked. "Doesn't look like it. No scrape marks. Just pressure." "Copy. Document it and move to the trench side. Check the strut mounts." I pushed off the hull, drifting toward the edge of the shelf. This was the part I hated. The habitat sat on a ledge, and just 10 feet away, the world ended. The cliff face dropped vertically into the trench, a chasm so deep the sonar couldn't find the bottom. I reached the edge of the railing. I was hovering over the abyss. My boots dangled over thousands of feet of nothing. I checked the struts. They were fine, rusty, covered in slime, but solid. "Struts look clear," I said, turning to head back. That's when I saw it. Far below me, deep in the trench, a light flickered. It wasn't the bioluminescence of a jelly or a lanternfish.
That light is usually a soft blue or green, continuous and wavering. This was a sharp, violet pulse. Flash. I froze, hanging on the rail. Miller? Killing my light. Say again? You're going dark? Trust me, killing main light. I reached up and clicked off my helmet lamp. The darkness crashed in instantly. It was suffocating. I was blind, floating in a void of ink. I waited. My breath roared in my ears. Flash. Flash. There it was again, straight down, maybe 500 feet below my position. 2 distinct pulses. I see activity in the trench, I whispered. Bioluminescent. Recorded, Miller said, uninterested. Squid shoals. I stared at the spot when the light had been. I didn't know why, but my hand moved to my helmet light switch. Instinct, curiosity, stupidity. I clicked my light on. Click, then off. Click. A single pulse of light into the dark. I waited. 5 seconds passed. Then, flash. A single violet pulse from the deep. My heart hammered against my ribs. Coincidence it had to be. I tried again. I clicked my light twice rapidly. On, off, on, off. Flash, flash. The response was immediate. 2 pulses, perfectly timed. The hair on my arm stood up so hard it hurt against the suit liner. This wasn't biology. Biology doesn't count. Davos, I said, my voice shaking. Are you seeing this on the cam? Seeing what? Davos asked, his voice thin. Just black, Cole. Just black. The lights! Look at the bottom of the monitor. I tried a complex pattern. 3 fast clicks. Pause. 1 long click. I stared down into the abyss, my breath held, my chest tight. Flash, 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 dot, 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 flash. 3 fast, 1 long. It was mimicking me. And then, as if to make sure I understood the scale of my mistake, the darkness changed. It wasn't just 1 light anymore. To the left of the first one, another violet star ignited, then another to the right, then 10 more, then 50. A massive geometric grid of violet lights flared to life in the trench below me. They weren't drifting with the current. They were stationary, arranged in a perfect semicircle, facing upwards, facing me. It looked like a city or a formation. Miller? I choked out, scrambling back from the rail, my boots scrabbling for purchase on the grating. Miller, get me in. Pull the line. Pull the goddamn line. What is it? What's happening? Miller barked. They're signaling, I screamed, forgetting protocol, forgetting the helium voice. There are hundreds of them. They're signaling back. Cole, your heart rate is spiking. You're hallucinating. Nitrogen narcosis, Miller stated calmly. Vent your regulator. Take a deep breath. I am not narked, I yelled, hauling myself hand over hand along the umbilical, swimming frantically toward the moon pool. As I scrambled into the wet pot, water thrashing, I took one last look back through the open hatch of the bell trunk. The violet lights were rising. They weren't just sitting in the trench anymore. The constellation was moving up the cliff face, fast. I slammed the hatch shut and spun the locking wheel, my hands shaking so bad I nearly broke my thumb. Pressurize, I screamed. Drain the pot. I sat on the bench, shivering uncontrollably as the water drained away, leaving me heavy and wet in the gravity of the bell. I ripped my helmet off. They're not fish, I gasped, staring at the steel hatch beneath my feet. They're not fish, Miller. Calm down, Cole, Miller's voice came over the speaker, weary. Come inside, we'll check the gas mix. You've been down too long. I looked at the depth gauge on the wall. 1,200 feet. But I knew with a sickening certainty the bottom wasn't 1,200 feet anymore. The bottom was coming up to meet us.
Miller didn't believe me. Of course he didn't. Pupils are reactive, he muttered, shining a penlight into my eyes. We were huddled in the main command module. I was still shivering, wrapped in a wool blanket, the phantom sensation of the cold water clinging to my skin. No nystagmus. You don't look narked, Cole.
I'm telling you, it wasn't narcosis, I insisted, my voice still pitched high by the helium, sounding like a terrified cartoon character. I signaled. They signaled back. It was a grid, Miller, a geometric formation. Nature doesn't do right angles. Refraction, Miller said, snapping the penlight off. He turned back to the console, refusing to engage with the insanity of what I was saying. You flashed a high-intensity LED into a thermal layer. The temperature gradient acted like a mirror. You were signaling at yourself. And the rising? The mirror was moving up the cliff. Currents shifting the thermal layer. It happens. He was rationalizing it away. He had to. If he admitted that there were lights down there mimicking us, the logic of our survival collapsed. Miller was a creature of procedure. If it wasn't in the manual, it didn't exist. Davos was sitting on the floor near the galley, knees pulled to his chest. He hadn't said a word since I came back in. He was staring at the main umbilical inlet, the thick bundle of hoses that punched through the habitat wall and snaked up 1,200 feet to the DSV Goliath. That bundle was God. It gave us heat, power, breathing gas, and voice communications. Without it, we were just meat in a sealed Tupperware container waiting to expire. "I'm calling topside," Miller said, grabbing the handset. "We're going to log the anomaly and request an ROE inspection of the trench. That'll settle it." He keyed the mic. "Topside, this is Theta. How do you read?" Static hiss. Then the bored, tinny voice of the life support technician on the ship. "Theta, this is topside. Read your 5x5. What's the status on the weld?" "Weld is incomplete. Diver aborted due to visual anomaly. We're requesting an ROV drop to Sector 47 relative to the habitat." "Copy that, Theta. Stand by. We're brewing fresh coffee up here. Might take a minute to get the ROV pilot out of the mess hall." Coffee, fresh air, sunlight. The casualness of the comment felt like a slap in the face. Up there, they were bored. Down here, we were being hunted. "Just get the drone in the water," Miller grunted. I watched the depth gauge. The needle was steady. The pressure was holding, but the air in the room felt electrified. I couldn't stop looking at the viewport, half expecting to see those violet lights pressing against the glass. Then, the habitat jumped. It wasn't a subtle vibration this time. It was a violent, jerking lurch, as if a giant hand had grabbed the entire station and shaken it. "Whoa!" Davos yelled, scrambling backward. Coffee cups slid off the table. A clipboard clattered to the floor grating. "Seismic?" I shouted, grabbing the edge of the bunk to steady myself. "Negative." He looked at the tension gauges for the anchor cables. "Anchors are solid. It came from above." We all looked at the ceiling, specifically at the point where the umbilical entered the hull. The thick, reinforced hose was moving. It was twisting in its collar, grinding against the seal with a sound like a dying animal screaming. The heavy rubber insulation was stretching, taut as a bowstring. "The ship," Miller said, his face draining of color. "The ship is drifting off station. They're pulling the line tight." He grabbed the mic again. "Topside, topside, check your dynamic positioning. You are dragging the habitat. Slack your lines. Repeat, slack your lines." Silence. No, not silence. A strange, rhythmic thumping sound coming over the speakers. Thump, screech. Thump, screech. "Topside, do you copy? You are putting critical tension on the umbilical." I looked at the tension gauge for the main line. It was redlining. The cable wasn't just being pulled, it was being yanked. "They aren't drifting," I whispered, realizing the horror of the physics. "The ship has thrusters that keep it locked in place to the inch. They wouldn't drift this fast." "Then what the hell is—" Snap! The sound was internal, coming from the speaker. It was a deafening electric crack, like a gunshot right next to the ear, followed instantly by a high-pitched whine that faded into absolute dead silence. The lights in the habitat flickered. The hum of the heaters faltered for a second before the backup batteries kicked in, stabilizing the power grid. But the speaker was dead. The comforting hiss of the open channel to the surface was gone. "Topside?" Miller said. He clicked the mic key. "Topside, acknowledge." Nothing. He switched to the secondary sound-powered phone, a fail-safe device that didn't need electricity. He cranked the handle frantically and pressed the receiver to his ear. "Bridge, this is Theta. We have lost main comms. Respond." He waited. He cranked it again. "Bridge, respond." Miller slowly lowered the handset. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw the crack in his armor. The gray flint of his eyes looked shattered. "Line's dead," he whispered. "Physical break. The copper is severed." "The gas?" I asked, my heart stopping. "Miller, the gas line?" We both rushed to the life support panel. I held my breath, waiting to see the flow meters drop to 0. If the gas line was cut, we had maybe 6 hours of emergency reserve in the banks before we suffocated. The needles hovered. They wavered slightly, but they held. "Gas is flowing," Miller exhaled, a long, shaky breath. "Power is fluctuating, but holding. Hot water is cycling." "So just the comms wire? Just the phone?" Davos said, his voice trembling. "It's a composite cable," I said, my mind racing. "The comms wire is the thinnest strand in the bundle. If the cable was stretched to the breaking point, the comms wire would snap first. The gas hoses are reinforced with Kevlar. They can take more tension." "So the ship pulled too hard?" Davos said, trying to find a rational explanation. "They had an engine failure. They drifted. They snapped the wire." I walked over to the viewport. I looked up towards the surface. I couldn't see anything, of course, just the eternal black. "If the ship had an engine failure," I said quietly, "they would have dropped the emergency acoustic beacon. They would be banging on the hull with a sledgehammer to send Morse code. They would do something." I turned back to them. "The cable didn't snap because the ship drifted. The cable snapped because something grabbed it from the middle." "Don't," Miller warned. "We felt the jerk, Miller. It wasn't a steady pull. It was a yank. Something grabbed the lifeline and pulled it down." "Stop it!" Davos screamed. He grabbed a heavy wrench from the workbench and hurled it at the wall. It clanged loudly, leaving a dent in the insulation. "Stop scaring us. The radio is broken. That's it. They're fixing it right now." The habitat fell silent. The only sound was the heavy, labored breathing of 3 men in a tin can and the groaning of the steel around us. We were alone, truly alone. At 1,200 feet, no one can hear you scream. And without the radio, no one even knew we were still alive. "We wait," Miller said, his voice flat. "Standard protocol. Loss of comms means we initiate a 24-hour hold. If they don't re-establish contact, they will send the recovery bell. We sit tight." I looked at the depth gauge again. "Miller," I pointed. He looked. The needle wasn't steady anymore. It was vibrating. "We aren't sitting tight," I said. "We're vibrating. The whole station is vibrating." Miller put his hand on the console. He felt it, a low-frequency hum that seemed to be coming from the cable attachment point. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the current. Something was climbing down the umbilical.
The vibration in the cable stopped as abruptly as it had begun. The silence that followed was heavier than the pressure of the ocean itself. It sat on our chests, a physical weight that made every helium-thin breath a conscious effort. Miller was at the life support panel, his face bathed in the red glow of the emergency lighting. He looked like a demon in a submarine movie, but his hands were trembling. "We have to check the connection point," Miller said. It wasn't a suggestion. "If the break is local, right at the habitat gooseneck, we can splice the copper. We can get the phone back. If the break is 1,000 feet up, we're blind." "I'll go," Davos blurted out. I looked at him. The kid was vibrating with a manic energy. His eyes were wide, pupils dilated so far that his irises were just thin rings of brown. He looked like he was about to snap, but in a different way than I expected. He was desperate for agency. He needed to do something to fix the world. "You're not certified for repair, kid," I said, my voice scratching through the thick air. "I'll go. You stay on the loop." "No!" Davos shouted, the squeak of his voice cracking. "I can't stay in here. I can't sit in the chair and listen to the silence, Cole. I need to fix it. I'm the smallest. I can climb the cage faster. Let me do it, please." Miller looked at me, then at Davos. He made a calculation. It was a cold, pragmatic equation. I was the best welder, the most experienced diver. If things went sideways later, he needed me inside to help hold the fort. Davos was expendable. "Suit him up," Miller said, turning back to the gauges. The process was grim. Usually suiting up is filled with banter, checks, and rhythmic patter. This was silent. I helped Davos into the hot water suit, checking the zipper, checking the seals. He was shivering, but he stood still. "Davos," I said as I lowered the heavy helmet onto his neck dam, "listen to me. You go up the external ladder. You check the gooseneck assembly where the main umbilical enters the roof. You look for a break. If you see anything, movement, lights, shadows, you abort. You don't ask. You drop and get back in the pot. Understood?" "Fix the phone," Davos mumbled. "Call the ship. Go home." Davos, "Understood?" Yeah, Cole. I got it." I locked the helmet. Click, thunk. I went to the comm station while Miller manned the gas rack. Davos dropped into the moon pool. "Diver in the water," Davos reported. His breathing was fast, ragged. Hiss, chug, hiss, chug. "I have you," I said into the mic. "Pay out slack. Go slow, kid." I watched on the monitor. The black and white feed from the moon pool camera showed the water churning as Davos disappeared into the dark. I switched to his helmet cam. The view was a chaotic swirl of bubbles and gray particulate matter. "I'm on the ladder," Davos squeaked, "climbing to the roof." "Copy. Keep your eyes on the structure. Don't look out." "It's cold," Davos whispered. "The water, it feels colder." "Hot water plant is operating at 100%. Suit temp is nominal. It's in his head." I watched the grainy feed as Davos crested the top of the habitat. The roof of Station Theta was a tangle of pipes, valves, and the massive anchor cables that held us to the seafloor. In the center, rising like a twisted tree trunk, was the main umbilical bundle going to the surface. "I'm at the gooseneck," Davos reported. "Visibility is bad. The snow is thick up here." "Check the junction box," I ordered. "Is the cable seated?" "Yeah." "Wait." Davos leaned in. The camera shook. "The casing, it's shredded." My stomach dropped. "Shredded how? Like it snapped?" "No," Davos breathed. "Like it was peeled. The rubber insulation is stripped back for 3 feet. I can see the copper strands. They're, Jesus, Cole, they're tied in knots." "Say again?" "The wires, they aren't snapped. They're knotted together, like someone played with them." A chill went through me that had nothing to do with the helium. "Davos," I said, my voice deadly serious, "back away. Return to the bell immediately." "I can fix it," Davos said, his voice rising in pitch. "I can untie it. I have my pliers. I can just—" "Negative," I shouted. "Abort. That wasn't an accident. Get back inside." "Wait," Davos said. He stopped moving. On the screen, the camera view tilted upward. He was looking up the length of the main umbilical, following it as it vanished into the darkness above. "Davos, move." "There's slime on the cable," Davos whispered. "Thick stuff. It's dripping down." Then the vibration returned. The entire habitat groaned. I felt it in the floorboards, but this time it was accompanied by a sound over the comms loop, a wet, slurping noise. "It's coming back down," Davos said. He sounded paralyzed. I see the lights. Cole, I see the lights." "Davos, drop!" "They're beautiful," he murmured. "Violet, so many of them. It's not a ship. It's a hand." "Miller,
"Reel him in!" I screamed, throwing the headset off and lunging for the umbilical winch control. But it was too late. On the screen, the darkness above Davos suddenly descended. It wasn't a slow creep, it was a plunge. A massive, pale shape slammed into the field of view. Davos screamed. It was the most horrific sound I have ever heard, a high-pitched, helium-distorted shriek of pure, primal terror that spiked the audio meters into the red. Scream! The camera feed spun violently. I saw flashes of the habitat roof, the black water, and then a blur of pale, translucent flesh. Something with too many joints. Then, the tension gauge on Davos's personal umbilical, the yellow hose connecting us, spiked. Crack! The sound came from the wet pot room, a whip crack that echoed through the station. I ran to the door of the wet pot, Miller right behind me. The yellow umbilical was whipping back out of the water, lashing the air like an angry snake. The end of it was frayed, torn apart. Not cut, torn. The screaming on the radio had stopped instantly. "Davos!" I yelled at the water. "Davos!" Silence. Just the churning of the water in the moon pool, settling back into a glassy black mirror. I looked at the end of the hose lying on the metal grating. The internal gas line was severed. The hot water line was spewing steam into the cold room. I looked at Miller. He was staring at the severed hose, his face ashen. "He's gone," Miller whispered. I walked to the edge of the pool and looked down. I expected to see blood. I expected to see debris. But there was nothing, just the deep, indifferent blue fading into black. Then, slowly, a single object floated to the surface. It was Davos's helmet light. It had been ripped from the mounting bracket. It bobbed in the water, the beam still on, shining up at the ceiling of the wet pot. And then, from the depths of the pool, a bubble rose. Then another, a massive burp of air from the depths, as if the ocean itself was laughing. We stood there, two men in a tin can, staring at the spot where our friend had been. The radio static hissed, empty and cold. "Lock the hatch," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Lock the goddamn hatch, Miller." Something was out there. It had tasted us, and now it knew exactly where to find the rest of the meat.
We sealed the bottom hatch. Miller spun the wheel until the veins in his forearms bulged like steel cables, locking the dogs so tight I thought the metal would shear. Then he slumped against the bulkhead, sliding down until he hit the grating. We sat there in the wet pot for a long time. The air was thick with the smell of wet rubber and the lingering coppery scent of catastrophic failure. "We have to purge the trunk," Miller said. His voice was a flat helium squeak that held no emotion. It was the voice of a machine executing a subroutine. "Standard protocol. If the diver is lost, we purge the trunk to prevent contamination." "Contamination?" I stared at him. "Davos isn't a contaminant, Miller. He was a kid." "He's gone, Cole," Miller snapped, his eyes snapping open. They looked glassy, unfocused. The umbilical snapped. At this depth, without gas, without heat, he was dead in seconds. We purge the trunk, we secure the habitat, we survive. We went through the motions. We drained the water from the trunk, we checked the pressure seals, we went back into the main living module. The habitat felt wrong. It wasn't just the empty bunk where Davos used to sleep, or the silence where his nervous fidgeting used to be. The air itself felt different. It tasted metallic, oily. I sat at the comms desk, staring at the dead handset. My head felt light, detached from my body. I looked at my hands. They seemed miles away. "Check the mix," I said, my tongue feeling too large for my mouth. "Miller, check the O2 scrubbers. The air tastes sweet." "Mix is nominal," Miller grunted from his bunk.
He was lying facing the wall, refusing to look at the empty space above him. PPO2 is 0.4, helium is steady. It doesn't feel steady, I insisted. I feel floaty, high-pressure nervous syndrome. The tremors. You see my hands? I held them up. They were vibrating, not shivering, vibrating, a high-frequency tremor that blurred the outlines of my fingers. It's shock, Miller muttered. Go to sleep. But I couldn't sleep. I sat in the red gloom listening to the station. The groans of the hull had changed. They weren't random anymore. They felt rhythmic. Creak, pause, creak, pause. Like the station was breathing in time with me. Then the radio crackled. My head snapped up. The main comms unit was dead. The copper wire was severed. We had established that. The speaker should be a brick. Hiss, pop, static, white noise. It washed over the room, soft at first, then spiking in volume. Miller, I whispered. The loop, it's active. Miller didn't move. Phantom voltage, induced current from the magnetic fields. Ignore it. Cole. My heart stopped. The voice was faint, buried under layers of electronic snow, but it was there. It was high-pitched, distorted by the helium, trembling with a terrified vibrato. Cole, let me in. I scrambled out of the chair and grabbed the edge of the console, staring at the speaker mesh. Davos? Don't, Miller warned from the bunk. He didn't turn around. It's not him. It's so cold, Cole, the voice whimpered. It sounded wet, gurgling. My line snapped. I drifted. I found the airlock. Please, cycle the lock. He's at the lock, I said, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Miller, he made it back. He's at the auxiliary airlock. He is dead, Miller sat up, his face twisted in a rictus of fury and fear. His line snapped at 1,200 feet. He didn't have a bailout bottle. His heater died instantly. He couldn't swim back against the current. Miller? Is that Miller? The voice on the radio cried. Open the door. The lights are looking at me. They're burning my eyes. I'm checking the lock, I said, grabbing a flashlight. Sit down, Miller roared, scrambling off his bunk. He blocked my path to the rear bulkhead. You open that outer door and you kill us both. You know the lockout procedure. You need to pressurize the trunk first. If you open it now, you breach the hull. He's outside, I screamed, shoving Miller back. Listen to him. Please, it hurts. The pressure. My teeth are popping. Let me in. The graphic nature of it made me gag. I could hear the wetness in his lungs, the sound of a man drowning in his own fluids while being crushed. I lunged for the viewport near the airlock. I pressed my face against the cold acrylate, shining my light into the black. Nothing. Just the particulate snow swirling in the current. Davos! I shouted at the glass. I can't see you! Where are you? I'm right here. Look at me. I'm waving. I stared. I strained my eyes until they burned. There was nothing there. There's no one there, Cole, Miller said softly. He had grabbed a heavy wrench and was holding it loosely at his side. Step away from the window. But the radio, I pointed at the speaker. Why won't you look at me? Am I ugly? The voice changed. The tremor was gone. The fear was gone. It became smooth, silky. Open the door, Cole. I have so much to show you. The city is waiting. The lights want to meet you. I backed away from the window, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. That wasn't Davos. The cadence was wrong. The vocabulary was wrong. Turn it off, I whispered. Miller, turn it off. I can't, Miller said. The power to the radio is cut. I pulled the breaker an hour ago. I looked at the console. The power light was dead. The breakers were pulled. The radio was receiving no electricity. Yet the voice continued, getting louder, filling the small steel tube. Open the door. It wasn't coming from the speaker anymore. I realized with a sick, vertiginous lurch where the sound was coming from. It was vibrating through the hull itself. Something was pressing on the outside of the station, vibrating the steel plates at the exact frequency to simulate a human voice inside our heads. Bone conduction. It wasn't a radio transmission. It was a mimic. "It's not electronics," I choked out, clutching my head. "It's on the wall. It's talking through the wall." "Let me in." The voice shifted again. It wasn't Davos anymore. It was Miller's voice, then mine, then a chorus of all three of us, overlapping, dissonant, screaming in a helium squeak harmony. "Open the door! Open the door! Open the door!" Miller lunged at the wall and started banging on the steel with the wrench. Clang, clang, clang. "Shut up!" Miller screamed at the ocean. "Shut up! We know you're there!" The chanting stopped instantly. The silence rushed back in, deafening and sudden. Miller stood there, panting, the wrench raised, sweat dripping from his nose. Then, from the other side of the 3-inch steel plating, right where Miller had struck the wall, came a sound. Knock, knock, knock. Polite, gentle. And then a voice, not electronic, not conducted, but muffled by the steel. A voice that sounded like it came from a throat the size of a sewer pipe. "We know you are in there, little meat." I sank to the floor, wrapping my arms around my knees. The gas mixture wasn't making us crazy. The hallucinations weren't in our heads. The monsters were real, and they knew our names. The voice didn't speak again. It didn't have to. The psychological phase of the torture was over. The physical dismantling had begun. For the first 10 minutes, it was quiet. But it wasn't the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath, calculating the angle of attack. Miller and I stood in the center of the habitat, backs to each other, rotating slowly like soldiers in a foxhole. Miller still gripped the heavy pipe wrench, his knuckles white, while I held a flare gun from the emergency kit, a useless gesture really. If I fired a magnesium flare inside a high-oxygen environment, we'd incinerate ourselves faster than the ocean could crush us. "It knows the layout," Miller whispered. The helium squeak was gone, replaced by a ragged, breathless rasp. "It found the comms cable first. It found the umbilical. It knows where the weak points are." "It's testing the welds," I said, watching the ceiling. "It's looking for a seam." Then, the assault began. It didn't start with a bang. It started with a scream. Not a human scream, the scream of metal being tortured beyond its yield point. Somewhere on the port side, near the galley, the 3-inch steel hull began to sing. It was a high-pitched, vibrating wail that drilled straight into the teeth. I spun around. The wall behind the microwave was moving. "Jesus Christ!" I breathed. The flat steel plating was slowly, impossibly bowing inward. It looked like an invisible fist was pressing against a sheet of aluminum foil. The thick layers of thermal insulation paint cracked and flaked off, showering the floor with white dust. Pop! Pop! Bang! Rivets sheared off, shooting across the room like bullets. One pinged off the opposite wall, missing Miller's head by inches. "Hull integrity warning," the automated system blared, the voice calm and synthetic, a horrifying contrast to the violence unfolding. "Stress fracture detected, Sector 2. Pressure differential nominal, but rising." "It's squeezing us," Miller yelled, dropping the wrench and scrambling for the damage control locker. "Get the bracing kit, the hydraulic jacks. We have to shore up that wall." We moved on instinct. The terror was there, paralyzing and cold, but the training overrode it. In saturation diving, hesitation is death. We grabbed the heavy telescoping steel jacks, usually meant for reinforcing damaged pipelines, and slammed them against the bulging wall. "Crank it!" Miller screamed.
I spun the handle, extending the jack until it bit into the floor grate and the bowing wall. The metal groaned in protest. We were fighting the strength of a leviathan with hand tools. As soon as the jack took the load, the pressure on that spot ceased. The wall stopped moving. The groaning faded. "It stopped," I panted, sweat stinging my eyes. "We held it." "No," Miller said, looking at the ceiling. "It didn't stop. It learned." The creature realized the wall was reinforced, so it moved. We heard the heavy sliding sound of massive bulk dragging itself along the outer hull. It moved over our heads, the sound of its passage vibrating through the roof plates like heavy footsteps on a tin roof. It stopped, directly above the life support manifold, the intricate web of pipes that brought our breathing gas and hot water into the habitat. Clang, crunch! The sound was sickening. It sounded like a car crash happening inside a closet. "Master alarm!" the computer shrieked. "External valve failure. Gas loop alpha compromised. Switching to loop beta." "It's attacking the plumbing!" I yelled, looking at the pressure gauges. The needle for the primary oxygen feed plummeted to 0. "It's ripping the pipes off the hull." Miller scrambled to the manual override valves. "If it tears the manifold out, it leaves a hole. It'll vent the atmosphere." We weren't just fighting a monster anymore. We were fighting the ocean. If the creature ripped a pipe loose, the pressure differential would force our atmosphere out or the ocean in. Either way, we were dead. Crunch! Another impact. This one shook the floor plates so hard I was thrown to my knees. The lights flickered and died, leaving us in the strobing red wash of the emergency beacons. "Loop beta compromised," the alarm continued, relentless. "Warning, life support critical, running on emergency reserves. Time to hypoxia, 6 hours." "It's stripping us," Miller said, his voice trembling. He was turning valves frantically, isolating the breached external lines, trying to keep the internal pressure stable. "It's peeling the station like an orange." The noise was deafening now. It wasn't just one point of attack. It sounded like multiple impacts, hammers banging on the airlock, claws raking across the viewport acrylic, the screech of tearing metal. It felt like we were inside a submarine being chewed on by a dog. I crawled towards the viewport. I had to know. I had to see the enemy. "Don't look!" Miller shouted, but I couldn't stop. I dragged myself up to the thick plastic window. The external floodlights were smashed, leaving the world outside in pitch blackness. But then, a flash of bioluminescence from the trench below lit up the scene for a split second. I saw it. It wasn't a squid. It wasn't a whale. It was a hand. A pale, translucent hand the size of a van, pressed against the glass. It had too many fingers, maybe 7, maybe 8, long, spindly digits with webbing between them. But the worst part was the texture. It looked soft, human. It had fingerprints. The palm pressed harder against the viewport. Crack! A spiderweb fracture appeared in the center of the 6-inch acrylic. The sound of the glass cracking was louder than the alarms. It was the sound of the end of the world. "The window!" I screamed, scrambling back. "It's breaking the window!" Miller looked up, saw the fracture, and his face went slack. The engineering solutions were gone. You can't jack a window. You can't weld glass. "Sector 4!" Miller roared, pointing to the rear of the habitat. "Get to the sleeping quarters, seal the bulkhead, abandon the command module." "But the controls, the gas regulation!" "We lose the controls or we lose our lives. Move, Cole." We scrambled over the debris, sliding on the condensate-slicked floor. The creature outside seemed to sense our panic. The attacks intensified. The habitat listed to the side, knocked off its level by the force of the blows. I dove through the circular bulkhead door into the cramped sleeping quarters. Miller was right behind me, dragging the emergency O2 tanks with him. As he pulled his legs through, the main viewport in the command room gave a terrifying groan. I looked back one last time. The spiderweb fracture was growing, branching out like lightning.
and behind the glass, in the faint red glow of the emergency lights, I saw something pressing against the fracture. An eye. A massive, milky white eye with a square pupil, staring right at me. "Seal it!" I screamed. Miller slammed the heavy steel door shut. He spun the locking wheel. Spin, spin, clunk. We collapsed on the floor of the tiny sleeping module. We were trapped in a coffin, and the ocean was knocking on the lid.
The sound of the ocean taking the command module wasn't a crash. It was a roar, a continuous, thundering avalanche of water that vibrated the very fillings in my teeth. The bulkhead door we had just sealed was the only thing separating us from instant annihilation. It groaned under the sudden, violent load, the steel crying out with a high-pitched metallic shriek that sounded like a dying train whistle. We were trapped in the sleeping quarters, a cylinder of space barely 8 feet long and 6 feet wide. Miller was pressed against the door, his hands hovering over the locking wheel, terrified that the mechanism would strip its threads and blow inward. "It's holding," Miller gasped, though he looked like he was trying to convince himself more than me. "The dogs are engaged. It's rated for the pressure. It has to hold." "Get back," I warned, pulling him away from the steel. "If that seal goes, the water will hit us like a solid wall. We'll be paste, Miller." We retreated to the far end of the compartment, huddling on the bottom bunk. The air in the room was rapidly changing. The temperature plunged. The command module had contained the main heating units. Now, with tons of near-freezing seawater pressing against the thin steel partition, the sleeping quarters were turning into a refrigerator. My breath started to fog in the red emergency light. Then came the hiss. It started low, a sibilant whisper that cut through the groaning of the hull. "Sssss." "You hear that?" I asked, freezing. Miller shined his flashlight beam around the cramped space. The air was filling with a fine, freezing mist. It swirled in the red light like smoke. "A leak," Miller whispered. "The seal, the gasket on the door is failing." He swept the light across the bulkhead. At the 3 o'clock position, right near the hinge, a needle-thin stream of water was spraying into the room. At 1,200 feet, water doesn't drip. It enters under roughly 540 pounds per square inch of pressure. It doesn't splash, it cuts. The stream was invisible, a coherent jet of water moving so fast the eye couldn't track it until it hit something. It was striking the aluminum frame of the middle bunk, shredding the metal and sending a spray of atomized water into the air. "Don't touch it," I screamed as Miller reached out instinctively. "It'll strip the flesh off your hand." The hiss grew louder, rising to a scream. The mist was getting thicker, soaking our clothes, chilling us to the bone instantly. The water level on the floor grate began to rise. "We have to plug it," Miller yelled over the noise. "If the gasket erodes, the whole door goes." "With what?" I shouted back. "You can't tape a high-pressure leak." "Mechanical pressure." Miller scanned the room. "The jack? Did we bring the jack?" "We left it in the command module." "Damn it." Miller grabbed the mattress from the top bunk, Davos's bunk. He ripped the foam pad off the frame. "We need to wedge something against it. Help me dismantle the bed frame." We went to work with the desperation of drowning rats. We kicked the aluminum frame of the bunk until the bolts sheared and the side rail came loose. It was a jagged 4-foot piece of metal. "The mattress first," Miller ordered. "Fold it. Make a plug." I folded the foam mattress into a dense square. My hands were numb, shaking violently from the cold and the adrenaline. The noise of the leak was deafening now, a piercing whistle that felt like it was drilling into my brain. "Ready?" Miller positioned the folded mattress against the bulkhead just to the side of the jet. On 3, we slided over the hole and jammed the rail against the opposite wall to hold it. 1, 2, 3. We slammed the foam pad over the leak. For a second, the water jet ate into the foam, shredding the first few inches of material like a buzzsaw, but the density of the compressed mattress held. The screaming whistle was muffled instantly, replaced by the heavy thud of the water hammering against the foam. "Brace it," Miller grunted, straining to hold the mattress in place against the relentless hydraulic pressure. I jammed the aluminum bed rail against the mattress and wedged the other end against the sturdy upright of the rear storage locker. It was a crude shore, a tension bar held in place by friction and prayer. "Let go," I said. Miller slowly released his weight. The rail bowed slightly, digging into the foam, but it held. The water stopped spraying into the room. Instead, it wept down the face of the bulkhead, a steady, freezing trickle that pooled on the floor. We collapsed on the remaining bottom bunk, gasping for air. The atmosphere was heavy, wet, and cold. The humidity was 100%. The walls were already slick with condensation. We bought time. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. That foam will disintegrate eventually. The air, I said, looking at the small emergency scrubbing unit on the wall. It was a passive lithium hydroxide curtain designed for short-term survival. How long do we have? With 2 of us breathing hard, 6 hours of scrub time, maybe 12 hours of oxygen in the bailout bottles. And then we go to sleep, Miller said. Carbon dioxide narcosis. It's peaceful, Cole. You just fade out. I looked at the bulkhead bore. It was bowing inward, pregnant with the ocean. They're in there, I whispered. Who? The things in the command module. We listened. Now that the screaming of the leak was muffled, we could hear the sounds from the other side of the wall. It wasn't just the water settling, it was movement. Scrape, scrape, thud. Something large was moving inside the flooded room we had just fled. We heard debris being shifted, the heavy clank of equipment being crushed. It was scavenging. It was going through our things. Then a sound that froze my blood in veins. Click, click, click. The same wet clicking I had heard on the radio. It was right against the door. It knows we're in here, I said, backing away until my spine hit the cold, curved wall of the habitat. It can't get through, Miller said, but his voice was hollow. The steel is steel. It held the water. The water is just pressure, Miller. That thing is intelligent. Scratch. A long, screeching sound of a claw dragging across the steel plate of the bulkhead. It started at the top and went all the way down, right over the spot where we had plugged the leak. The makeshift brace groaned. The mattress shifted a fraction of an inch. A spurt of water hissed out, then stopped as the foam resealed. It's testing the seal, I realized with horror. It can hear the leak. It knows that's the weak point. We sat in the dark, the red emergency light bathing us in the color of a developing bruise. We were shivering violently now, huddled together for warmth in the wreckage of the bunk. We were no longer saturation divers. We were no longer men. We were canned food, waiting to be opened. And the opener was scratching at the lid. Cole? Miller whispered, his teeth chattering. If it breaches, if that door opens... He reached into his flight suit pocket and pulled out a heavy dive knife. He looked at it, then at me. We don't let the water take us. The physics, the implosion, it's too fast. But if we drown, if it takes us... He didn't finish the sentence. He placed the knife on the mattress between us. I looked at the knife. Then I looked at the porthole in the sleeping quarters, the single small 6-inch window that looked out into the abyss on the other side of the station. The only way out was up, and up was impossible. Cole, I said softly, look at the porthole. He turned. A soft violet light was filtering in through the glass, illuminating the swirling mist in our tiny prison. The lights weren't just in the trench anymore. They were surrounding us. The knife lay on the damp mattress between us, gleaming dully in the strobing red emergency light. It was a standard-issue diving knife, 6 inches of serrated stainless steel with a blunt tip for prying, a tool. But in the claustrophobic freeze of the sleeping quarters, it looked like an exit strategy. Miller was staring at it. His lips were blue, trembling with the early stages of hypothermia. The makeshift patch on the bulkhead door hissed softly, a constant reminder that the Atlantic Ocean was only being held back by a piece of foam and a bent bed frame. "Don't look at the window," Miller whispered, his voice sounding brittle, like dried leaves stepping on gravel. He was hugging his knees, rocking slightly. "If you don't acknowledge it, it's just physics, just biology. Don't give it a soul, Cole." But I couldn't help it. The violet light filtering through the small 6-inch porthole wasn't static. It was pulsing. It had a rhythm, a slow, hypnotic undulation that seemed to sync with the pounding of my own heart.
It washed over the condensation on the walls, turning the water droplets into glittering purple jewels. It was beautiful, and that was the most terrifying thing about it. I crawled across the wet floor grating. The cold from the steel seeped through my flight suit, numbing my knees, but the pull of that light was magnetic. It was the only thing in this dying metal coffin that felt alive. I reached the porthole. The acrylic was freezing, radiating a chill that felt like it could burn skin. I placed my hands on the rim of the window and pressed my face close to the glass, shielding my eyes from the red strobe of the habitat interior. At first, all I saw was the swarm. Thousands of tiny luminescent particles were swirling in the water outside, like a blizzard of violet sparks. They moved in synchronized patterns, spiraling and weaving. They weren't plankton. They were distinct, purposeful sparks of energy. Then the background shifted. The darkness beyond the swarm didn't dissolve. It approached. A massive shape eclipsed the violet snow. It was so large that for a moment I lost my sense of scale. I thought I was looking at a rock formation, a cliff face of pale, smooth stone drifting past the station. Then the cliff face blinked. I recoiled, my breath hitching in a strangled gasp, fogging the glass. I wiped it frantically with my sleeve. It wasn't a rock, it was a face. Suspended in the black water, less than 3 feet from the glass, was a head the size of a small car. It was pale, a sickly, translucent white, like the belly of a dead fish or skin that has been soaked in water for weeks. You could see the faint blue webbing of veins beneath the surface, pulsing with a slow, thick sludge. It was humanoid, but distorted by the crushing physics of the deep. The skull was elongated, bulbous, and hydrocephalic, stretching back into the darkness like a fleshy teardrop. It had no nose, just 2 vertical slits that fluttered as it sampled the water. But it was the eyes that broke me. They were enormous, taking up 1/3 of the face. They were milky white, devoid of irises, glowing with a faint internal luminescence. And in the center of those cloudy orbs were the pupils, rectangular, horizontal slits, like a goat's, but pitch black. It was staring right at me. "Miller," I whispered, unable to look away. It looks like us." "It is not us," Miller snapped, his voice rising to a shriek. "It's a monster! Stop looking at it!" The creature didn't move. It hovered with an impossible stillness, defying the currents that were buffeting the station. It was studying me. I felt a piercing intelligence radiating from those dead white eyes. This wasn't the gaze of a shark, blank and predatory. This was the gaze of an anthropologist looking at an insect in a jar. It shifted slightly, bringing a hand up to the window, the hand I had seen earlier. It pressed the palm against the glass, the long webbed fingers spread out, encompassing the entire viewport. I could see the fingerprints, swirls and ridges just like humans, but larger, deeper. The suction of its touch caused the acrylic to groan. Then it tapped. Click, click, click. The sound vibrated through the glass, through my skull. It was the same rhythm, the same knock. The creature pulled its hand back and did something that made my bladder let go. It smiled. The lower half of the face split open. It didn't have lips, just a seam in the flesh that peeled back to reveal rows of translucent, needle-thin teeth. But they weren't arranged in a jaw. They were circular, spiraling down into a black throat. And inside that throat, deep within the gullet of the beast, I saw the source of the violet light. A pulsing biological core sat in its throat, flashing in time with the swarm outside. It was speaking. The light was its voice. Flash, flash, pause, flash. It was the code I had signaled. It was repeating my own greeting back to me. Hello, hello, I see you. It's mocking us, I whimpered, sliding down the wall until I hit the floor. I couldn't look at it anymore. The recognition was too visceral. It looked like a drowned man who had been resurrected by the pressure, expanded and twisted into a god of the trench. It's conscious, Miller. It knows exactly what we are. It wants the air, Miller muttered, picking up the knife. He was staring at the door, his eyes wide and unblinking. It smells the oxygen. It's just hungry. No, I said, shaking my head, tears streaming down my face. That's the hypoxia talking. That's the CO2. Snap out of it. We have to let them in, Cole, Miller whispered, taking a step toward the leaking bulkhead door. He wasn't looking at the door anymore. He was looking at the foam patch. He was looking at the spot where a single slice of a blade would unleash the Atlantic. The creature in the window tapped again, louder this time, impatient. Click, click, click. Miller's smile widened. He lunged. The distance between Miller and the leaking bulkhead door was less than 5 feet. In a space that small, violence isn't cinematic. It's a chaotic, ugly tangle of limbs and desperation. When Miller lunged, he didn't scream. He moved with a terrifying, silent focus, the dive knife held low in a grip that spoke of intent. He wasn't trying to fight me. He was trying to bypass me. His target was the foam mattress pressed against the door, the only thing keeping the Atlantic from filling our lungs. I threw myself at him, my shoulder slamming into his ribs. We hit the metal floor grate with a bone-jarring crash that shook the already unstable room. The impact knocked the wind out of me, but I scrambled for purchase, wrapping my arms around his waist, trying to pin his arms. "Don't do it, Miller," I screamed, the helium voice cracking into a sob. "It's a trick. They're in your head." Miller was strong. He possessed that dense, wiry strength of men who have spent 30 years wrenching valves on the bottom of the world. He bucked his hips, throwing me off balance, and scrambled towards the door on his hands and knees, the knife dragging across the grating with a screech of steel on steel. "Davos is waiting," Miller rasped, his voice sounding like wet gravel. "He says the city is warm, Cole. No more cold, no more bills, just the light." I grabbed his ankle and yanked him back. He kicked out, his heavy boot catching me square in the jaw. Stars exploded in my vision, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug. I didn't feel the pain. I only felt the terrifying certainty that if that knife touched the foam patch, we were dead. I scrambled up his back, locking my arm around his throat in a chokehold. I squeezed with everything I had, trying to cut off the blood to his brain, trying to put the man I respected to sleep before he killed us both. "Drop it!" I yelled into his ear. "Drop the knife!" Miller didn't drop it. Instead, he drove his elbow backward into my solar plexus. The air left my lungs in a ragged whoosh. My grip loosened for a split second, and he spun around, slashing the knife wildly in the red gloom. The blade bit into my forearm, a line of fire that instantly turned cold as the blood welled up. We grappled in the center of the tiny room, slamming into the aluminum bunks. The noise was deafening, the grunt of exertion, the clang of metal, and the relentless click, click, click from the creature at the porthole. I caught a glimpse of the window over Miller's shoulder. The massive face was still there, pressing against the glass. The violet light was strobing faster now, a frenetic pulse that seemed to be cheering us on. It was enjoying this. We were gladiators in a fishbowl. Miller pinned me against the lockers. His eyes were wide, black pits of pupil, entirely swallowed by the dilation of the dark. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. "Open the door, Cole," he whispered, bringing the knife tip inches from my eye. "Let the ocean in. It washes the debt away." "It's not the ocean, Miller," I headbutted him, a desperate, savage blow to the bridge of his nose. I felt cartilage crunch. He reeled back, stunned. The knife wavered. I didn't hesitate. I couldn't afford to be his friend anymore. I lunged for his wrist, seizing it with both hands. I twisted his arm, forcing the blade down, away from my face. We stood there, locked in a trembling stalemate, our faces inches apart. I could smell the stale sweat, the fear, and the metallic tang of the blood running down his face. "Miller, please," I begged, tears mixing with the sweat on my cheeks. "It's the gas! It's the pressure!" For a second, the madness in his eyes flickered. The pupil contracted slightly. He looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the man I knew trapped behind the horror. "Cole, it won't stop talking," he wheezed. Then the creature outside the porthole let out a sound that penetrated the hull, a low, resonant thrum that vibrated the floorboards. Miller's eyes snapped back to black. The mercy vanished. "Time to go," he snarled. He threw his weight forward, trying to drive the knife into my chest. I sidestepped, letting his momentum carry me past me. He crashed into the bunk frame, but he didn't stop. He scrambled towards the bulkhead patch, raising the knife to slash the foam mattress. I had no choice. I grabbed the emergency fire extinguisher from the wall bracket, a heavy steel cylinder. "No!" I screamed. As Miller swung the knife down towards the patch, I swung the cylinder. It connected with the back of his skull with a sound that I will hear every night for the rest of my life. A wet, heavy thud that sickened me to my core. Miller collapsed instantly. The knife clattered to the floor, sliding harmlessly away from the patch. He hit the grating face down and didn't move. I dropped the extinguisher, my hands shaking so violently I could barely stand. "Miller," I whispered. I crawled over to him. I rolled him over. His eyes were open, staring up at the ceiling, but the light was gone. The madness was gone. There was just the blank, empty stare of the dead. I checked for a pulse. Nothing. I sat back on my heels, gasping for air in the freezing room. I was covered in my own blood and the blood of my supervisor. I had just killed the only other human being within 1,000 miles. I was alone. The silence returned to the room, broken only by the hiss of the leak and the groaning of the hull. Then a slow clapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. I looked at the porthole. The creature was still there, pressing against the glass. The violet light was strobing faster now, a frenetic pulse that seemed to be cheering us on. It was enjoying this. We were gladiators in a fishbowl. Weak, chilling gas seeped through the grating from Miller's bunk. Dad's pneumovoralanix brana liquid had come full circle. I looked at Miller's body, then at the knife on the floor. A wave of despair washed over me, heavier than the water outside. I could just pick up the knife. I could slash the patch myself. It would be quick. The pressure would be a sledgehammer. No pain, just the end. I reached for the knife. My fingers brushed the cold handle. But as I touched it, my eyes fell on Miller's wrist. He was wearing an old analog dive watch, a battered Seiko he'd had for 20 years. On the strap, scratched into the rubber, were initials. S.M. Sarah Miller, his daughter. He'd talked about her during the decompression stops on previous jobs. She was graduating college this year. He was doing this job to pay for her tuition. I pulled my hand back from the knife. "No," I hissed at the window. "No!" I stood up. My legs felt like lead, but a cold, hard rage was burning in my gut. I wasn't going to give that thing the satisfaction. I wasn't going to be meat in a can. I looked at the wall above Miller's bunk. There, behind a red safety glass panel, was a large yellow lever. Emergency ballast jettison manual override. It was a last resort. It blew the explosive bolts on the lead weights attached to the bottom of the habitat.
Without the weights, the habitat would become positively buoyant. We would rocket to the surface. Uncontrolled ascent, the bends, lung expansion injuries, the risk of the hull rupturing from the rapid pressure change. It was a 50-50 shot at suicide. But it was better than dying in the dark with that thing watching me. I walked to the panel. I didn't look at the creature. I picked up the fire extinguisher again and smashed the safety glass. "You want in?" I said to the face in the window, grabbing the yellow lever. I yanked the lever down.
The sound of salvation was violent. When I yanked the yellow lever, I expected a mechanical clunk, a hiss of hydraulics, something engineered and precise. Instead, the explosive bolts holding the ballast weights fired with the force of an anti-tank round. Cracoom! The floor of the habitat didn't just vibrate, it kicked. The entire station bucked upward, throwing me into the ceiling. I slammed my shoulder against the conduit pipes, the impact driving the breath from my lungs, but I didn't care. The sensation of gravity had shifted. We were no longer heavy. We were a cork held under water by a giant's thumb, and the thumb had just slipped. "Hang on!" I screamed at no one, grabbing the frame of the bunk as the world tilted 45 degrees. The ascent began. It wasn't a drift, it was a launch. The habitat, freed of 10 tons of lead keel, rocketed upward. The sensation in my stomach was sickening, a continuous lurch of acceleration that pinned me to the floor grate. But we weren't free yet. From outside, a sound tore through the hull that drowned out the rush of the water. It was a screech of tearing metal, like a freight train locking its brakes on rusty tracks. The station shuddered, halting its upward momentum with a jarring crash that rattled my teeth. Screech! The habitat swung wildly, penduluming in the dark. We weren't rising anymore. We were dangling. I pulled myself up to the porthole, ignoring the throbbing pain in my arm and the blood slicking my hands. The creature hadn't let go. Through the thick, scratched acrylic, I saw the swarm. The violet lights were frantic, buzzing around the station like angry wasps, but the massive pale face was gone. Instead, I saw a limb, a thick, translucent rope of muscle and flesh wrapped around the external strut of the habitat. It was anchored to the seabed, stretching tight, taut as a bowstring. It was trying to drag us back down. The station groaned, the steel rivets popping like gunfire. Ping, ping, ping. The hull was being stretched on a rack. The creature was fighting the buoyancy, matching the lifting force of the air-filled tank with its own impossible strength. "Let go!" I howled, pounding on the glass. "Let us go!" The habitat listed further, tipping almost onto its side. Miller's body slid across the room, his dead limbs tangling with the loose gear, his blank eyes staring up at me, as if asking why the ride was so rough. Then the physics took over. The buoyancy of a pressurized steel bubble at 1,200 feet is immense. The upward force was exponential. Something had to give. It wasn't going to be the air. Rip. The sound was nauseating, wet and metallic. Outside the window, I watched as the creature's limb didn't just let go, it sheared. The jagged metal of the strut acted like a saw blade. Under the immense tension, the pale flesh gave way. A cloud of dark, viscous fluid exploded into the water, blacking out the window. The habitat lurched free. If the initial launch was fast, this was a rocket sled. Without the drag of the creature, we accelerated. The water rushing past the hull sounded like a jet engine, a roar of cavitation and turbulence. I was pinned to the floor again, unable to stand. I watched the depth gauge on the wall, an old analog dial that had survived the smashing of the command module. The needle was spinning counterclockwise. 1,000 feet, 800 feet. That's when the pain started. They call it the bends because the pain in your joints makes you bend over in agony, but that's a cute name for what is essentially your blood turning into soda water.
We were ascending at a rate of 10 feet per second. The helium and nitrogen dissolved in my tissues were expanding faster than my lungs could off-gas them. It started as an itch, a maddening sensation under my skin, like thousands of ants crawling beneath the dermis. Formication. My skin turned mottled and red, the capillaries bursting. 600 feet. The fire turned into fire. My elbows and knees felt like someone was driving hot nails into the bone marrow. I curled into a ball, screaming, but the sound was thin and weak. The gas in my stomach expanded, making me retch dry, heaving sobs. 400 feet. The air inside the habitat was getting colder as the pressure dropped, expanding the gas volume. Fog filled the room, a thick white soup. I couldn't see Miller anymore. I could only hear the roar of the water and the popping of my own sinuses. Pop, squeal. My left eardrum ruptured. Warm fluid ran down my neck. The vertigo hit me instantly, the room spinning in a nauseating vortex. I looked at the porthole one last time. The violet lights were gone. The blackness of the abyss was fading. It was being replaced by a deep twilight blue. We were leaving the midnight zone. We were entering the world of light. But the creature wasn't done. Even through the roar of the ascent, I felt a heavy thud on the roof of the sleeping quarters. Then another thud. Something was clinging to the hull, a hitchhiker. I saw a shadow pass over the porthole. Not the giant. It was too small. It was one of the smaller ones, the size of a man. It crawled over the glass, its milky eyes peering in, its mouth opening to reveal those spiraling needle teeth. It was shrieking, a sound that penetrated the steel, a high-pitched vibration of pure rage. It was riding the bomb all the way to the top. 200 feet. The pressure differential was tearing the unauthorized passenger apart. I watched with grim satisfaction as the creatures on the glass began to bloat. Its translucent skin puffed out, unable to handle the drop in pressure. Its eyes bulged. 100 feet. Splat. The creature didn't let go. It exploded. It burst into a cloud of pale slime and cartilage, smeared across the viewport by the rushing water. We were a missile now, unstoppable. "Brace," I whispered, squeezing my eyes shut, my body a knot of agony. The breach was the most violent moment of all. We hit the surface not with a splash, but with a collision. The habitat erupted from the ocean, shooting 20 feet into the air like a breaching whale. The sudden loss of water resistance was jarring. For a split second, there was weightlessness. The roar of the water vanished, replaced by the howl of wind. Then, gravity reclaimed us. We fell back down. Crash! The impact with the surface was like hitting concrete. I was thrown across the room, slamming into the locker. I heard ribs crack. The habitat bobbed violently, rolling in the heavy Atlantic swell, turning the inside into a washing machine of debris, water, and corpses. I lay on the ceiling, which was now the floor, gasping for air that felt too thin, too cold. The red emergency lights flickered and died, leaving me in gray gloom. But through the porthole, for the first time in 30 days, I saw it. Gray light. Real, unfiltered, miserable gray light. Sky. I tried to crawl toward the window, but my legs wouldn't work. The nitrogen bubbles had gathered in my spine. I was paralyzed from the waist down. I dragged myself with my arms, my breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. I coughed, and blood splattered onto the grating. I reached the window and looked out. The ocean was rough, heavy swells of slate-gray water capping with white foam. Rain was lashing against the glass. And there, in the distance, maybe half a mile away, was the DSV Goliath. It wasn't drifting. It was dead in the water. No smoke from the stacks, no deck lights. It looked abandoned. I squinted for the pain, trying to focus. The ship was listing heavily to the port side, and hanging from the stern crane, that massive winch that held our umbilical. It was bent, twisted down toward the water like a crumpled paperclip. Something hadn't just pulled our cable. It had pulled the ship down to meet it. I slumped against the cold wall, the laughter bubbling up in my throat, sounding like broken glass. We had surfaced, but I wasn't sure if we had been rescued. I closed my eyes as the pain finally pulled me under. The last thing I heard wasn't the wind or the waves. It was the sound of the hull cooling in the surface air. Click, click, click. Or maybe that was just inside my head.
I woke up screaming, but there was no sound. My throat was raw, a dry canyon of scar tissue, and my lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. The first thing I registered was the light. It wasn't the suffocating red of the emergency strobes, nor the crushing black of the trench. It was white. Blinding, sterile, fluorescent white. It burned my retinas, forcing me to squeeze my eyes shut. "He's back," a voice said, distorted, tinny. Vitals stabilizing, dialing the pressure down to 60 feet. I tried to move, but my body felt like it was encased in concrete. My legs were heavy, unresponsive logs. My arms were strapped to the rails of a narrow bed. I forced my eyes open. I knew this ceiling. Curved steel, white paint, heavy bolts. I was back in a box. Panic surged, a cold spike of adrenaline that nearly stopped my heart. I thrashed against the restraints, a guttural noise tearing from my throat. "Easy, Cole, easy." A face appeared in the small circular viewport above me. Not a pale, fish-eyed monster, a human face, a woman with glasses and a surgical mask. "You are in the hyperbaric recovery unit at Portsmouth Naval Hospital," she said, her voice calm, practiced. "You are undergoing therapeutic recompression. You have severe decompression sickness. You've been in and out for 6 days. Do not fight the restraints." Portsmouth. Land. I stopped thrashing. I lay there, listening to the hiss of the oxygen inlet. It sounded exactly like the scrubbers on Station Plata. The sound made me nauseous. "Miller," I croaked. The word was a rusty nail in my throat. "Davos." The woman in the window didn't blink. She just checked a clipboard. "Rest now. The debriefing team is waiting until you're lucid." The next week was a blur of agony and hiss. They kept me under pressure, slowly stepping me back to 1 atmosphere, trying to shrink the nitrogen bubbles that had turned my spinal cord into Swiss cheese. The pain in my joints was a constant low-frequency hum, punctuated by spikes of agony that made me wish I had drowned. When they finally opened the door and wheeled me out into the real world, the air felt wrong. It was too thin. It didn't have weight. I felt like I was going to float away. They put me in a private room, no windows, just a TV that I didn't turn on, and a pitcher of water that I didn't touch. 2 days later, the suits arrived. There were 3 of them, 2 men in expensive charcoal suits who smelled of expensive cologne and legal threats, and 1 Navy officer in dress blues who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Mr. Cole," the taller suit said, placing a briefcase on the table. He didn't offer his hand. "I'm Julian Vane, legal counsel for Air Deep Sea Solutions. This is Commander Holloway." "Where is Miller?" I asked, staring at the ceiling. "Mr. Miller did not survive the ascent. The trauma from the impact was fatal. The autopsy confirmed blunt force trauma to the cranium." He paused, letting the implication hang there. They knew. They had found the fire extinguisher. "And Davos?" "Mr. Davos was lost at sea due to an equipment malfunction during an unauthorized EVA. Tragic." "Unauthorized," I whispered. I looked at the commander. "You found the ship, the Goliath?" The commander shifted uncomfortably. He looked at Vane, then back at me. "The support vehicle suffered a catastrophic failure of its dynamic positioning system during a rogue weather event. It capsized. There were minimal survivors." "A weather event," I laughed. It was a dry, hacking sound. "Is that what you call it?
A storm that grabs a ship and pulls it under? Vane opened the briefcase. He pulled out a thick document and a check. He slid the check across the table. I looked at the number. It was enough to buy a house, a big house, far away from the ocean. We understand that you have suffered significant trauma. Nitrogen narcosis at that depth can cause vivid, shared hallucinations, paranoia, psychosis. It's a well-documented phenomenon. The monsters you saw, the lights, the voices, the brain creates patterns where there are none to cope with the sensory deprivation. The hull was dented. The viewport was smashed from the outside. Debris, Vane said instantly, and the viewport failure was due to the rapid pressure change during the uncontrolled ascent caused by Mr. Miller's dissolved. They had it all worked out. Miller went crazy. He smashed the viewport. He killed Davos. I hit Miller in self-defense and panicked, blowing the ballast. A neat, tragic story of cabin fever. And the claw marks? The scratch on the bulkhead? Structural fractures. He tapped the document. This is a non-disclosure agreement. It states that you agree with the official findings of the investigation, structural failure and pilot error. In exchange, Air Solutions provides full medical coverage for your rehabilitation and the settlement sum attached. I looked at the check. Then I looked at the water pitcher. I could see the condensation dripping down the side of the glass. Drip, drip, drip. It sounded like a knock. If I sign this, I never have to go back? Your diving career is over, Mr. Cole. You have permanent nerve damage in your legs. You'll walk with a cane if you're lucky. You're grounded. Good, I said. I picked up the pen. My hand shook, but I signed. They left quickly after that. They didn't want to be in the room with the broken thing any longer than they had to. That was 6 months ago. I live in Arizona now, the desert. It's dry here. The air burns your lungs, and the ground is hard, cracked earth. There is no ocean for 1,000 miles. I walk with a cane. My left leg drags a bit, a constant reminder of the nitrogen bubbles that ate my nerves. I don't sleep much. When I do, I dream of violet lights and pale faces pressing against the glass. I don't shower. I take sponge baths. I can't stand the feeling of being submerged. I can't stand the sound of the pipes groaning when the water turns on. Sometimes, at night, when the wind howls over the mesa, it sounds like the hull of the station settling. But the worst part isn't the dreams. Yesterday, I was washing my face in the sink. I had the stopper in, filling the basin. I leaned down, splashing the water on my skin, trying to wash away the dust. I froze. The water in the sink was vibrating. It wasn't the plumbing. It wasn't a truck driving by outside. Ripples were forming in the center of the basin, pulsing in a perfect rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. I stared at the drain, the dark black hole leading down into the pipes, leading to the sewer, leading to the river, leading to the sea. Water is connected, all of it. It's one vast, singular organism wrapping the planet. And from deep down in the drain, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. Click, click, click. I backed away, grabbing my cane. I left the water running. I haven't been back in the bathroom since. They know where I am. The NDA doesn't matter. The money doesn't matter. I thought I escaped the pressure, but I was wrong.